They had been told the Americans would humiliate, starve, or kill them. So when U.S. soldiers ordered them to strip for showers, many thought it was the end. What happened next shocked them all. They marched with their boots caked in mud, uniforms rumpled from nights spent on cold ground, and eyes darting in every direction. The war was over, but the fear hadn't ended for these young German women. Telephone operators of the Wehrmacht surrender meant stepping into the unknown. Just days earlier, they had been told by superiors that capture would bring humiliation at best and cruelty at worst. Every rumor had painted the Americans as merciless. Yet here they were, May 1945, Upper Bavaria, being funneled through barbed wire gates of a U.S. 7th Army enclosure near Bad Aibling. No one spoke above a whisper. A few clutched their coats tight, others stared at the ground. One woman, Erica, muttered to the girl beside her, "They will mock us. They will starve us." Her friend shook her head, too drained to answer. The column came to a halt before a group of American soldiers. The guards weren't shouting insults, nor did they raise their rifles in menace. Instead, one of them barked orders. In clipped German, "Line up, medical inspection first." The women exchanged puzzled glances. An inspection. Not the abuse they feared. Nurses in white armbands stood ready, notebooks in hand. Each woman was checked, eyes examined for disease, arms rolled up to check for lice bites, hair combed for nits. The process was mechanical, clinical. Still, every gesture made their stomachs knot tighter. When the delousing powder came out, the shock deepened. Clouds of dust were shaken over their clothes, settling into their hair and skin. Some coughed, others gagged. Erica brushed furiously at her blouse, convinced she was being poisoned. "What is this?" she cried out, her voice shrill. A nurse replied in broken German, "For lice, you're fine." The line shuffled forward at the next checkpoint. The unexpected order rang out. A soldier pointed toward a row of makeshift stalls where steam curled from tin pipes. "Showers. Everyone showers." The word hit them like a stone. A murmur ran through the line. "Showers." One woman repeated, suspicion dripping from her tone. Another clutched her arm and whispered, "Do you think it's real? Or is it something else?" They had all heard stories from the East, terrible stories whispered about camps where showers meant death. Fear tightened in their throats, but the guards were calm, almost bored. Bars of coarse green-brown soap were handed out. Erica held hers as if it were an alien object, staring at the stamped U.S. Army letters pressed into the block. She sniffed it sharp, almost chemical, but undeniably soap. The queue moved forward. Steam fogged the air, dripping off metal pipes. They could hear the rush of water striking the floor. The sound was ordinary, domestic even. But to them, it was terrifying. It could be a trick, a voice hissed. Another muttered, "Why would they waste water on us?" At the threshold of the shower stalls, hesitation rippled through the group. Some women stopped, refusing to move until guards gestured them on. Others shuffled inside, trembling as they peeled off their uniforms. For years, they had lived on meager rations under constant bombardment, surrounded by lies about the enemy. To stand naked in front of strangers, clutching a bar of soap, it felt like stepping off a cliff into darkness. Then, with the turn of a valve, water poured from the pipes. It was not gas. It was not a trick. It was hot water hissing against skin that hadn't felt true warmth in weeks. Soap foamed between fingers, suds streaked down arms and legs, grime and lice washing away in rivulets that pooled at their feet. Some cried quietly. As the reality sank in, it was real. The Americans had given them soap and showers. For a moment, shame mixed with relief. Shame at their own suspicions. Shame at how far their nation had fallen. And relief so deep it hurt. One girl whispered, "It's just water." Another answered through tears, "Yes, just water." But the relief didn't erase the weight of captivity. The guards waited outside their old lives' uniforms, duties, orders. were gone ahead lay weeks, maybe years in barbed wire camps, yet in that steam-filled stall rinsing off the filth of retreat they realized something vital. Defeat did not mean annihilation. The shock of hot water and the smell of soap cut through fear more effectively than any speech could. In that small, mundane act of hygiene, the world shifted. It was no mercy, no luxury, only procedure. But it was enough to show that the rules of this new life would be different from what they had been told. But while the showers marked their first surprise, the days leading up to this moment carried their own tension. And to understand the weight of their fear, we need to return briefly to the collapse of the Reich itself. The road to that shower stall had begun long before. By May 1945. Germany was unraveling in every direction in Upper Bavaria. The last days of the Reich were not marked by heroic battles or final stands, but by confusion, hunger, and the clatter of retreat villages, once filled with banners and parades, now echoed with hollow silence, broken only by columns of soldiers trudging south in hopes of escaping the advancing Soviets. For the young women in the Wehrmacht's auxiliary service life had narrowed to a blur of phone lines, messages, and half-heard orders. Many of them had joined, not out of burning ideology, but because the war had reached into every corner of their existence. One girl, Marta, had taken the position at 16 after her father was drafted. She had worked in Munich Central Telephone Exchange. Patching calls between officers. By the end, the phones rang endlessly, with reports of collapsed units, cut-off roads, blocked cities in ruins. The propaganda they had grown up with still blared on radios. Though it no longer matched the world around them, posters insisted on final victory. But the women saw retreat with their own eyes. Every train station was crammed with refugees carrying bundles of bedding. Mothers pulled children by the hand, old men limped on canes, and wounded soldiers slumped on benches with blank stares. American planes roared overhead. Strafing columns on the road, the women whispered to each other during their shifts, "If they are here already, where is the promised army that will save us?" When Munich fell in late April, shock rippled through their ranks. Many were ordered south toward the foothills, told to regroup and keep communications alive for units that no longer existed. By the time they reached, bad Aibling uniforms were stained with sweat and travel dust. The war that had once seemed so distant was collapsing right under their boots. Rumors filled the void, left by real orders. Some said the Americans would shoot female auxiliaries on sight, punishing them for serving in Hitler's military. Others whispered darker tales from the East, stories of mass rapes and reprisals, as the Red Army swept through for these women. Surrender felt like gambling with their lives each night on the march. They huddled together in barns or schoolhouses, trading fears in hushed tones. "Better to throw away the uniform," one girl urged. "They will think we are civilians, and if they find out we lied," another countered, "that could be worse." The group decided almost wordlessly to keep their uniforms on. It was a strange badge of shame and protection at once. If the Americans caught them, at least they could say they had not hidden the truth. Hunger added to their dread. The last field kitchens had been abandoned. Miles back, and their bread rations were gone. They chewed on raw turnips pulled from gardens, or shared a crust traded with villagers by the time the U.S. patrol spotted them. Most were too weak to protest. Hands went up, not in defiance but in surrender, trembling from exhaustion. The Americans moved quickly, stripping them of weapons they didn't have, cataloging names, and herding them toward the wire. But even then, fear clung tight, Erica later said. She had rehearsed her own death in her mind, waiting for the moment the rifles would be turned on them. Instead, they were told to walk, and keep walking, until the gates of the enclosure shut. Behind them, inside, everything looked both strange and ordinary. Tents were pitched in neat rows. Soldiers carried clipboards and barbed wire ringed the space. This was not the image of chaos they had been warned about. It looked almost organized. That sense of order, however, did little to calm their nerves. The war had taught them that appearances often hid something worse. The women clung to each other as names were recorded, ages noted, and details written down by Americans who spoke halting German or relied on interpreters. They were just entries on a form, numbers on a sheet, faces to be processed. The strangeness of being reduced to paperwork hit them hard. Still, compared to the road, there was something different here. No bombs, no strafing planes, no collapsing buildings. The silence of captivity was heavy, but it was not the chaos of the front for its brief moment. Standing behind wire with their belongings at their feet, they realized they were alive, and that survival itself now carried its own kind of weight. But survival was only the beginning, because the moment of first contact with the Americans would challenge everything they had been told to believe about their captors. The first real encounter came not with shouts or blows, but with orders delivered in a flat, matter-of-fact tone. When the gates clanged shut behind them at Bad-Aibling, the women braced for humiliation. Yet what they saw instead were rows of tents, supply crates stacked neatly, and soldiers moving with the same discipline they might have used in their own barracks back in Germany. It was not kindness, but it was not cruelty either. The guards were young, many, no older than the women themselves. Their uniforms were dusty from the road, helmets, slung low, rifles hanging across their chests. They did not sneer or jeer. They treated the group like one more task to be completed. More set of bodies to account for in a war that had dragged on too long, that in its own way was more unnerving than insults the women had expected. Rage. What they received was indifference. Form a line. An American sergeant called his accent heavy, but words sharp. He held a clipboard, not a weapon at the ready. An interpreter beside him repeated the order in German. The women shuffled into rows, hugging themselves against the chill. Their boots scraped the dirt, and for the first time since surrendering, they raised their eyes. One girl, Annalisa, whispered, "They don't even look at us, as if we're nothing." Another muttered back, "Maybe that is better." The sergeant's questions came briskly. Name, age, unit, place of capture. Each answer was written down. Each voice measured and filed away to the women. It felt like standing before a judge who cared little for guilt or innocence. Their entire identity was reduced to words scrawled in a ledger. After paperwork came the collection of possessions. Pockets were emptied. Scarves, watches, even small lockets were taken, tagged and stored. It stung, not because of the loss itself, but because of the stripping away of the last remnants of normal life. Marta's locket, which held a photograph of her brother killed on the Eastern Front, was dropped into a canvas bag. She nearly reached to snatch it back, but the cold stare of the guard stopped her. It was then that the first sliver of humanity appeared. A soldier sorting through the pile of belongings noticed Marta's trembling. He paused, held up the locket, and in hesitant German said, "Picture, family." She nodded, lips pressed tight. He studied it for a moment, then slipped it into a smaller pouch, marked with her name, making sure she would get it back later. No smile, no warmth, just a small gesture of procedure carried out with a touch of care. It caught Marta off guard more than anything else that day. The women were LED to a sectioned-off area, with straw on the ground. Guards stood at the perimeter, rifles slung but not aimed. The prisoners sat in silence, knees pulled to their chests, glancing nervously at their captors. Every sound, the creak of boots, the crack of a rifle strap, the murmur of English words they couldn't understand fed their unease. As night fell, they were given tin cups filled with watery stew and a hunk of bread. The food was coarse, but after days of hunger, it tasted almost unreal. Erica tore at hers in silence, then muttered, "This is more than we had last week," her friend whispered back. "Don't say it out loud." They might hear over the next hours. The realization grew that these Americans were not acting out of hatred. They were operating under rules, Guards rotated shifts, meals arrived at regular intervals, and the women were watched closely. But not harassed, the camp ran with an order that contrasted sharply with the chaos of the retreat they had left behind. Still, suspicion lingered. It could change tomorrow. One prisoner said, "They could decide we are worth less than this bread." The others nodded, clinging to it. Their doubts, like armor, the first contact had not broken them, but it had unsettled the narrative they had carried in their minds. The enemy was supposed to sneer, to strike, to treat them as less than human. Instead, they were logged, sorted, and fed. It was not kindness, but it was not cruelty. It was something in between, and that was almost harder to understand. But if this initial encounter tested their expectations, the processing that followed the inspections and the strange rituals of hygiene would shake them. Even more, morning came with a whistle and the heavy thud of boots on packed earth. The prisoners stirred from uneasy sleep, straw clinging to their uniforms. Hair tangled, mouths dry, they had expected shouting or blows, but what greeted them instead was another set of orders. All prisoners line up. Medical inspection today, the women obeyed. Though their steps were heavy with suspicion, they formed a ragged column waiting as American soldiers set up tables stacked with papers, boxes of supplies, and metal canisters that hissed faintly. The sight of the canisters sparked alarm. Whispers raced through the line. "What is that? Chemicals, poison." Their fear grew as memories of whispered stories from the East pressed into their minds. At the head of the line, a U.S. Army doctor adjusted his spectacles, clipboard in hand. Nurses in white armbands moved briskly. Speaking to each other in English, the scene had the air of routine. But for the women, every gesture carried menace. The inspection began. Each woman stepped forward, her name checked against the roster, her eyes and skin examined for signs of disease. Gloves snapped against wrists, thermometers were used. Foreheads touched, the women flinched. At every movement, Martha, shivering, tried to explain through broken words that she was healthy, but the medic barely looked up, jotting notes as if she were no different from hundreds before her. Then came the delosing soldiers, opened the canister, shaking a fine white powder over the women's heads and shoulders. The dust clung to their hair, their uniforms, their skin. They coughed violently, waving their hands in panic. Erica cried out, "What are you doing?" An interpreter standing nearby answered quickly, in German, "For lice?" "Not poison lice," the explanation calmed some, but not all. The humiliation of being dusted like cattle cut deep one girl. Katerina turned to her friend and whispered bitterly, "This is how they show we are nothing, not even worth clean hands." Her friend, however, stared at the ground silently, relieved it had not been gas. After the powdering, they were ordered to strip down to underclothes for a full inspection. The shame was suffocating. To be exposed under the gaze of strangers felt like another form of defeat. A few tried to cover themselves with torn coats until guards barked at them. To move faster, one nurse checked hair for lice, with a comb pulling it through strands as the women clenched their fists in humiliation. And yet, even in this degrading process, there was an odd sense of order. The nurses spoke softly, almost indifferently, never mocking the soldiers, kept their distance, eyes averted when possible. It wasn't kindness, but it wasn't the cruelty they had braced for. It was clinical, as though they were simply problems to be solved once the inspections ended. The women were handed worn towels and pointed toward the stalls. Steam drifted up, carrying the unmistakable sound of rushing water. The guards pressed soap into their hands, coarse olive-colored bars with U.S. Army stamped across them. The word spread quickly down the line. Showers. Marta clutched her bar of soap like a weapon, whispering to Erica, "Do you believe it? Hot water?" After all this, Erica shook her head, unable to answer. The fear was still there, rising like bile. Too many stories had poisoned their minds. Showers, they had been told, could mean death. The line inched forward. The steam thickened. They could hear splashes dripping. the echo of women's voices from inside the stalls. Some sounded startled, others almost relieved. Those waiting outside exchanged anxious looks, each wondering if this was truly safe. When it was finally Marta's turn, her legs trembled as she stepped inside. She peeled off her uniform, clutching the soap, tightly bracing for the worst. A soldier turned to the valve and water sprayed down in steady streams. Marta gasped. It was hot, real, scalding, cleansing, hot water. She rubbed the soap between her hands, foam forming the grime of weeks on the road, washing down her arms in gray streaks. Her body shook, not from fear now, but from something she could barely name: relief. Around her, other women began to wash tentatively, at first, then, with urgency. Tears mixed with soap suds, the water carried away not only dirt, but also the lies they had been fed for years. This was not the brutality they had expected. It was regulation procedure, a strange, sterile act of care. When the shower ended, they dried quickly, pulling on their clothes with haste, still afraid of what might come next. Yet nothing did. They were sent back to the enclosure cleaner than they had been in weeks, their skin raw but alive. For the first time since capture, silence hung differently between them. It was not the silence of fear, but of confusion. What did it mean that their enemies had given them soap and hot water? The answer was unclear, but the question would stay with them. But as they processed this shock, the act of bathing was only the beginning. The true emotional breaking point came when they realized what that shower symbolized. In contrast to the propaganda they had grown up with, the moment the first stream of hot water touched their skin, something shifted. For weeks, their bodies had been stiff with grime, lice crawling in seams of fabric, the sour odor of unwashed sweat clinging to every inch of them. Now, as the water struck, it carried away not only the filth of retreat, but also the poison of expectation. Still, it was not easy to accept. Inside the row of makeshift stalls, steam clouded the air, turning shapes into silhouettes. The women stood in awkward silence, clutching soap, their backs to one another. Some moved quickly, scrubbing furiously, as if afraid the water might stop at any moment. Others froze, eyes shut tight, waiting for something terrible to happen. Marta, her shoulders hunched, whispered, "It feels wrong to be naked here in front of them, like we are animals." Erica answered, voice trembling, "At least the water is real." The soap foamed easily, its sharp, earthy scent filling the air for the Americans. It was just another bar from a supply crate, indistinguishable from thousands handed out to soldiers, but to these women, it was a revelation. They rubbed it over arms, faces, legs, watching the dirt dissolve into streaks that swirled down the drains. The sound of rushing water grew louder, and with it came a strange release. One girl, Anna, leaned against the wall, tears mixing with the spray. She whispered to no one in particular, "I thought this was the end. I thought they were going to kill us." No one answered, but several heads bowed in silent agreement. The fear had been real, sharpened by propaganda and whispers of atrocities. And yet here they were, washing with American soap. The guards outside called out occasionally, their voices muffled by the steam. They weren't shouting threats, only reminding the women to move along. Nurses passed towels through the entrance, their hands, brisk eyes fixed on the task rather than the prisoners' bodies. It was strangely impersonal. Like an assembly line for some, this indifference was harder to grasp than cruelty would have been. Annalise muttered bitterly, "We are nothing to them, just work to be done." But even she could not deny the relief in her voice when she admitted, "At least they don't look at us the way we were told they would." The process was quick. 10 minutes, maybe less, before each woman stepped out, dripping and red-skinned, clutching a towel. The nightmarish fear of poison faded with each new group that returned alive and clean. Soon the whispers shifted from Suspicion to disbelief. Do you think they care about us? No, it's just their rules. But even rules can have meaning. The showers became more than hygiene. They were proof that the war was not the only truth they had known for years. They had been told the Allies would destroy them utterly. Show no mercy, treat them as vermin. And yet here they were alive, cleaner than they had been in months, their bodies humming from the shock of heat and soap till the relief came laced with shame. Many of the women had believed that the propaganda repeated it to others, built their lives around its lies, to realize that the enemy followed rules, even in victory, struck hard. Marta admitted quietly, "We were told they would strip us of our dignity. But it is our own leaders who lied." No one contradicted her. Later, back in the enclosure, the women sat together in silence, towels draped over shoulders, damp hair clinging to cheeks. Their uniforms, though still threadbare, smelled faintly cleaner. Erica rubbed the soap between her fingers again and again as if trying to prove it was real. She whispered, This means something. I don't know what. But it does. The shower scene did not erase the humiliation of captivity, nor did it suddenly make their future secure. But it was a turning point. For the first time, they glimpsed that survival might not mean degradation. It might, in its own limited way, include dignity, even if it came through something as simple as soap and water. That night, lying on straw mats beneath the watchful eyes of guards, the women replayed the moment in their minds. Some cried softly, unable to reconcile fear with relief. Others stared upward, wondering what else they had been wrong about. The water had not only washed their bodies, it had rinsed away the edges of the lies they carried. But the weight of this experience could not be measured fully without comparing it to the poisonous propaganda they had grown up with, which painted their captors in the darkest colors imaginable from childhood. These women had been raised on carefully crafted images in schoolrooms. Teachers spoke of enemies who wanted to crush Germany and enslave its people. Posters showed Americans as savages with exaggerated features, brutal and wild, eager to tear down everything German. Even in their auxiliary service during late-night shifts at switchboards, the radio still crackled with speeches describing Allied cruelty. The message was always the same. Surrender would mean ruin. But the camp at Bad Aibling told a different story. The Americans didn't greet them with hatred. They processed them like inventory, gave them bread and watery stew, and most astonishingly, soap and showers. The disconnect gnawed at their minds. If everything they had been told about the Allies was false, then what else in their world had been a lie? One evening, sitting on the straw inside the enclosure, Marta voiced the question none of them wanted to say aloud. Why would they treat us this way? Why not punish us? Erica shook her head. Maybe they are mocking us, making us think we are safe. No. Another girl interjected softer. If they wanted to kill us, they wouldn't waste water. They follow rules. The idea of rules was foreign to them. In this context, they had been taught that war was merciless, that enemies would abandon any sense of honor. Yet here, under the guard of young men who looked barely older than themselves, they began to see that the Americans acted according to regulations they had heard of the Geneva Convention, but it had always seemed distant, something only officers cared about. Now those international promises were shaping the course of their captivity. Still, suspicion lingered. Propaganda had not just frightened them, it had shaped their identity. To let go of that fear meant letting go of part of what they thought was truth, and so they wavered. One moment, they accepted the showers as proof of American order. The next, they whispered that the kindness was temporary. One night, as the guards handed out bread, Katerina held hers tightly and said under her breath, "They must want us alive. For something, nobody does this without reason." Her words captured the unease of the group. Was this treatment genuine? Or did it mask some hidden purpose? The irony was that the Americans were not thinking so deeply about it for them. The procedures were standard delousing medical checks, showers, food rations. These were all written into Army manuals. It was less about compassion and more about sanitation and discipline. Yet from the women's perspective, every detail carried meaning. Every bar of soap and cup of stew became a symbol of unexpected humanity. One afternoon, the women overheard two guards speaking in English. Their words half understood. The only phrase that stood out was "same rations Army standard." The interpreter later explained that prisoners were meant to receive food comparable to what U.S. soldiers ate. The women stared in disbelief. Marta whispered, "They feed us like their own." The realization was too large to fit into the picture of the brutal enemy they had grown up fearing. The contrast weighed heavily on them. On the road south, they had seen starving German civilians, skeletal refugees begging for scraps. Yet here inside a prisoner enclosure, they were handed bread and soap. It was a paradox. They struggled to reconcile. The propaganda had painted captivity as the worst fate imaginable. But in truth, it offered them more stability than the collapsing Reich. Outside this dissonance sparked quiet reflection. For the first time, some began to question not only what they had been told about the enemy, but also what they had been told about their own nation. If the Americans obeyed rules, why hadn't their own leaders done the same? Why had they been forced to march south on empty stomachs while cities burned? The questions had no easy answers. For now they sat in silence after each day's routine. Heads lowered, thoughts circling the showers had marked the first fracture in the wall of propaganda, and every meal, every guard rotation widened. The crack. The women did not suddenly see the Americans as saviors. That leap was too far. But they began to understand that defeat did not mean annihilation, and that truth was far more complicated than the lies they had lived under. But while this realization grew slowly, it was in the daily routines of camp life, the rations, the inspections, the endless structure, that the true shape of their captivity began to form. By the second week of captivity, the shock of surrender had dulled into routine. Life inside the American enclosure followed a rhythm that was both foreign and oddly predictable. At sunrise, the guards whistled, and the women were lined up for head counts. The roll call was brisk. Names checked against lists, faces scanned, numbers tallied. Then came the distribution of food. Metal tins filled with porridge in the morning. A slice of bread at midday and stew or beans by evening. It was plain, sometimes watery, sometimes salted too heavily. But compared to the gnawing hunger of the retreat, it was almost abundant. The camp itself was a patchwork of tents, barbed wire, and wooden guard towers. Inside, the prisoners were grouped in sections divided by rope barriers. Straw bedding lay on the ground, thin and scratchy. But it was better than the open road. Latrines were dug at the far end, covered with canvas for privacy. Buckets of water were brought in regularly, sometimes with soap rationed out. Again, everything was designed for order, efficiency, and hygiene to the women. This order carried a strange double edge. On one hand, it spared them the chaos of the outside world. There were no bombs falling, no sudden marches in the middle of the night, no collapsing front lines. On the other, it reinforced their captivity. Every whistle, every head count, every scheduled meal reminded them that freedom had ended. Erica once murmured to Marta as they sat eating beans from a dented tin, "We live like clockwork now. Everything at their time, their way." Marta, chewing slowly, replied, "But at least we lived the guards. Rotated in shifts, faces changing every few days. Some were standoffish, speaking little, their expressions carved in stone. Others seemed barely older than the prisoners, fumbling with German phrases or grinning awkwardly when their words came out wrong. One guard, a tall farm boy from Iowa, tried handing out bread with a broken beet shun, which made several of the women laugh despite themselves. It was the first time since surrender that laughter had slipped into the enclosure. Nurses visited too, checking for lice, distributing ointments, and treating fevers. Their presence was unsettling, gentle hands touching arms and foreheads, administering medicine instead of pain for years. The women had been told that the enemy would treat them with cruelty, strip them of dignity, and leave them to rot. Instead, they found themselves subject to a kind of mechanical care. It was not affection, not kindness, but it was attention. And that was enough to spark confusion. At night, the camp quieted. The prisoners whispered to each other, voices low so guards wouldn't overhear. They spoke of home, of mothers and siblings scattered by the war, of fathers never returned from the front. They argued over whether their captivity was a curse or a hidden form of mercy. Katerina, still bitter, said one night, "They want us weak. That is why they keep us here fed but useless." Anna countered softly, "If they wanted us useless, they would have left us to starve on the road. This is different." The truth sat somewhere in between. The Americans did not see them as equals, but they did not see them as garbage either. They were prisoners, subject to rules, part of a vast system of war that had swallowed millions. From time to time, rumors drifted through the enclosure. Some came from interpreters, others from overheard snippets of English. There was talk of prisoner transfers to larger camps of the Red Cross, inspecting conditions of some captives being shipped overseas. Each rumor sparked a fresh wave of anxiety. Would they be moved? Would they vanish into the belly of another war machine? None of the women knew. And the not knowing knotted them as much as the captivity itself. Still, there were small mercies. A guard occasionally tossed a cigarette butt into the enclosure, and those who smoked shared it greedily. A nurse once handed Marta an extra crust of bread when she noticed her thin frame, little gestures that did not erase the wire fences but softened the sharpness of captivity. Day by day, the women learned the contours of this new life. The camp was not freedom, but neither was it the terror they had imagined. It was something harder to name, a gray zone where survival mixed with shame, where order replaced chaos, and where each routine task had count rations. Inspections reminded them of a war that was finished yet still pressed its weight upon them. But the camp itself was only the setting. It was in the fleeting human encounters, the brief words, the exchanged glances, the quiet gestures that their understanding of this strange captivity deepened for all the order and structure of camp life. What lingered most were the moments when the prisoners and their captors brushed against each other in ways that were unscripted. These were not the official routines of rations or roll calls, but the quiet, almost accidental interactions that reminded both sides they were human. It began with small things. A soldier dropping a piece of bread on the ground, and instead of discarding it, handing it to one of the women with a shrug, as though to say food is food. Another time, a guard caught two prisoners whispering in line, and rather than snapping at them, simply muttered quiet in German. That was clumsy, but not hostile. These small breaks from strict regulation stood out sharply because they felt real, unfiltered. One afternoon, Marta watched as a young American soldier leaned against the fence smoking. He noticed the women staring, and after a pause, tossed the half-finished cigarette into the enclosure. Several rushed for it, passing it hand to hand, each taking a desperate drag. The guard watched his face unreadable, then turned away to him. It might have been nothing to them. It was a reminder of a world outside the wire where small indulgences still existed. There were words, too. When language allowed, some of the guards spoke fragments of German, picked up during the campaign Essen. They said as they handed out food, schnell, when urging the line to move faster. Sometimes it sounded harsh, but sometimes it carried the awkward rhythm of someone trying to communicate beyond orders. One evening, Erica gathered courage to speak back. A guard was struggling with the word for blanket. She pointed to the pile and said it slowly. "Deck," he repeated it, his accent bending the word oddly, and she corrected him. Laughing softly, he grinned, shrugged, and tried again. For a few moments, the war, the wire, the uniforms, all of it faded. It was just two young people fumbling over words. The nurses offered another kind of encounter, unlike the guards. They sometimes looked directly into the women's eyes as they worked. When one girl developed a fever, an American nurse knelt beside her, pressed a hand to her forehead, and spoke softly in English. The words were not understood, but the tone was clear reassurance. The woman was given aspirin and water, checked. Again, the next morning she survived that survival, owed not to chance, but to care. Rattled the prisoners more than the showers had yet. Not every moment was gentle. There were times when frustration slipped through a guard, irritated at the slowness of the line, barked orders with a sharpness that made the women flinch. Another confiscated a trinket. One of them had hidden, tossing it into a bag. Without explanation, these incidents reminded them that they were still captives, their fate controlled by strangers, but even the harsher moments were different from what they had been taught to expect. There was no deliberate cruelty, no calculated humiliation. Instead, there was impatience, weariness, the marks of soldiers who had seen too much war and wanted it. Over the women discussed these encounters endlessly at night. They replayed each word, each gesture, weighing them against the propaganda that still echoed in their minds. Katerina remained skeptical. "Don't trust them?" she said firmly. "A smile can hide anything but." Marta shook her head. "Maybe not. Everything is a trick. Maybe sometimes it's just people." The tension between fear and recognition grew stronger. With each passing day, the Americans did not treat them as equals, but neither did they treat them as monsters. That gray area was confusing, even painful, because it forced the women to confront a possibility. They had long rejected the enemy was human too. For some, this realization brought a kind of fragile hope. If the Americans could show small acts of humanity even in victory, perhaps the future would not be only darkness for others. It deepened their shame to see compassion in the faces of those they had been told were brutes, was to confront how deeply they had been misled. And yet these fleeting encounters, whether kind or stern, became the fabric of their days in captivity. Each one chipped away at fear, reshaping it into something harder to name. Confusion, humility, reluctant respect. But the real turning point came not from the guards or the nurses, but from within the prisoners themselves, as they began to reflect on what all of this meant for their own understanding of the war and their place in it. By the third week, the women no longer trembled at every whistle or command. The fear had not vanished, but it had shifted. What knotted them now was not the threat of violence, but the slow realization that everything they had believed was crumbling. The Americans had not starved them, beaten them, or paraded them in shame. Instead, they had been given rations, blankets, medical care, and soap. The shock of this truth weighed heavier than the wire fences at night when the camp quieted and the guards paced lazily under the glow of lanterns. The women whispered their thoughts into the dark. Marta often LED the conversations, her voice steady, almost detached. "We were told surrender would be worse than death," she said one evening, pulling her damp hair back into a braid. "But we are here alive, cleaner than we've been in months. They lied to us." Katerina bristled. "Lied? Yes, but don't think they are friends. We are still behind their wire." "No one said they are friends," Marta replied. "But they are not monsters either. That matters." The group fell silent. They knew she was right. It was a thought they had resisted, because admitting it meant admitting that their leaders had deceived them for years. The sense of betrayal stung worse than the loss of freedom. Erica, who had clung most tightly to fear, began to soften. She spoke of her father, who had fought on the Eastern Front and never returned. If he had been captured here, not there, maybe he would still be alive, she whispered. The others murmured agreement. Everyone knew the difference between capture in the West and in the East. The stories from the East were horrific. But here under American Guard, life continued restricted, but survivable days turned into markers of thought. Each meal was a reminder of rules followed. Each inspection was proof that order, not chaos, governed their fate. Slowly, the women began to understand that captivity under rules carried its own strange dignity. They were not free, But neither were they destroyed. The showers in hindsight grew larger in their memory. What at first felt like humiliation now appeared as a symbol. Soap and hot water had become a dividing line between what they had feared and what was real. Marta once put it plainly, "The water showed us the truth. Not kindness, not cruelty, just humanity following rules." Yet the reflection was not without pain. Shame seeped in, shame for the years spent believing lies, shame for the hatred they had felt toward people they had never met, shame for realizing that the enemy had treated them with more consistency than their own leaders had given civilians. In the final days, some tried to resist this self-examination. Katerina insisted that it was weakness to admit such thoughts. We cannot praise them. They still hold us captive, but her protests rang hollow even to herself. She too had felt the relief of soap, the steadying calm of routine meals, the touch of a nurse's hand checking her pulse. Denial was becoming harder to sustain. The women began to carry themselves differently, not proudly, but with a cautious awareness that they were more than victims of defeat. They were witnesses to a truth their fellow countrymen outside might never grasp. The enemy could obey rules even in victory, and that knowledge, though small, carried weight on one particularly cold night. Anna spoke softly as the others lay awake. "When this ends, if it ever does, I will tell my children that the Americans gave me soap that they made me wash when I thought I would die. Maybe that will mean something." Her words drifted into the silence. Heavy with the promise of memory in their reflections, the women found no easy answers, but they found a kind of clarity. War had stripped them of certainty. Propaganda had filled them with fear, but captivity had given them a truth they could not ignore. But their story was not only about reflection, it was also about what came after, when the showers and the rations became more than procedure, and instead a lesson they would carry for the rest of their lives. When the gates finally opened weeks later, and the women were transferred to a larger prisoner camp, the memory they carried with them was not the barbed wire or the head counts. It was the soap. It was the showers, that first surreal moment when what they expected to be the end of their lives turned out to be nothing more than hygiene. In the years that followed, when they spoke of their captivity, that detail always surfaced. It was a symbol, a reminder that survival often wears the mask of the ordinary. For many, the shower was the first crack in the wall of propaganda they had lived behind. They had been told for years that surrender to the Americans meant brutality. Yet it was the Americans who gave them soap, who enforced hygiene, who provided food at regular hours. These weren't acts of generosity. They were protocol regulations written into army handbooks, but to the women stripped of illusions and facing the unknown. They felt like a revelation. Marta would later recall how she pressed the bar of soap to her face, inhaling the sharp scent, unable to believe that it was real. Erica remembered the steam rising from the pipes, the fear that it might be gas, and the flood of relief when it wasn't. Anna said she cried, not because she was humiliated, but because she felt for the first time in weeks clean. The detail might have been small, but it had the weight of survival. The experience left them with a lesson that grew clearer as years passed. Dignity is not always found in triumph or pride. Sometimes it comes in the simplest acts. Warm water on skin, a shared cigarette butt, a nurse's hand checking a fever. Those moments reminded them that humanity can endure even when nations fall apart. It also forced them to confront their own beliefs. If the enemy could follow rules, if they could treat captives with order instead of cruelty, then perhaps everything they had been told was wrong. That realization brought shame, but also growth. They had been deceived, yes, but in captivity, they had also been given the chance to see the truth with their own eyes when the war ended, and some of them eventually returned home. The story of the showers became part of their private histories. Not everyone wanted to hear it in bombed-out towns, surrounded by grief and loss. tales of Americans giving prisoners soap sounded trivial, even absurd. But to those who had lived it, it was not trivial at all. It was proof that survival could come in forms no one expected in the long years that followed. The women carried the lesson with them. Humanity is tested in extremes, but it can show itself in the smallest gestures: a bar of soap, a bowl of stew, a guard who tries awkwardly to say blanket in German. These details mattered because they reminded the prisoners that even in war, rules and decency could still hold power for those who survived. The memory of that first shower stayed vivid. It was not just about water and soap, it was about perspective. It was the moment when they realized that defeat was not the end of being human. It was the moment they understood that survival often comes in ways you least expect, and that dignity once thought lost can be restored, in something as simple as washing away the dirt of war. The moral they drew was clear: never let lies define how you see others, and never underestimate the weight of small mercies. Even in captivity, even in defeat, there can be a spark of humanity strong enough to break through fear. So when we look back at their story today, it reminds us that history isn't just shaped by battles and treaties. It is shaped by the small human moments that outlast the gunfire. Soap and showers may not appear in official records of the war, but for those women, it was the memory that defined their captivity, and that leaves us with a question worth carrying forward in our own lives. When conflict or hardship threatens to strip others of dignity, will we choose cruelty, or will we choose something as simple and as powerful as giving them the chance to wash and begin again? If this story has given you something to think about, don't forget to subscribe for more history brought to life through the voices of those who lived it.